After the unhappy events which had just befallen her, my mother longed to reunite her 3 remaining sons around her. My brother, having been ordered to join the expeditionary force which was being sent to India under the command of General Decaen, was given permission to spend 2 months with my mother. Felix was at the military school, and a piece of good fortune brought me also to Paris. The School of Cavalry was then at Versailles. Every regiment sent there an officer and a non-commissioned officer who, after completing their studies, returned to their unit to act as instructors. Now it so happened that at the moment when I was about to ask for permission to go to Paris, the lieutenant who had been at the school had completed the course, and the colonel proposed to send me to replace him. I accepted this with pleasure, for not only would it allow me to see my mother again, but it would ensure that for 18 months I would be living only a short distance from her. My preparations were soon made. I sold my horse, and, taking the stagecoach, I left the 25th Chasseurs, to which I was never to return. Not being aware of this at the time, my farewells to my comrades were light-hearted. On my arrival in Paris, I found my mother greatly upset, not only on account of the cruel loss which we had just suffered, but also over the imminent departure of Adolphe for India and the detention of my uncle Canrobert, which continued indefinitely. We spent a month together as a family, at the end of which my elder brother had to report to Brest, where he was soon embarked for Pondicherry in the Marengo. As for me, I went to settle in at the School of Cavalry, whose barracks were in the great stables of Versailles. I was lodged on the first floor, in apartments which had once been occupied by the Prince de Lambesc, the master of horse. I had a very big bedroom and an immense salon which looked out over the Avenue de Paris and the parade ground. I was at first astonished that the most recently arrived pupil should be so well housed, but I soon learned that no one wanted this apartment because its huge size made it glacially cold, and few of the officer pupils could afford to keep a fire going. Happily, I was not entirely without means. I had a good stove put in, and with a big screen I made, in this vast apartment, a little room which I furnished modestly, since all we were issued with was a table, a bed, and 2 chairs, which were quite out of place in the enormous space of my quarters. So I made myself reasonably comfortable until the return of spring, when the place seemed quite charming. Although we were called pupils, you should not suppose that we were treated as students. We were allowed every freedom, too much freedom in fact. We were commanded by an old colonel, Monsieur Maurice, whom we hardly ever saw, and who did not take part in anything. On 3 days in the week we had civilian horsemanship, under the celebrated equestrians Jardin and Coupe, and we went there when it suited us. In the afternoon, an excellent veterinarian, Monsieur Valois, ran a course on the care of horses, but no one compelled us to study with any diligence. The other 3 days were devoted to military matters. In the morning we had military horsemanship, taught by the only 2 captains in the school, and in the afternoon, drill, also taught by them. Once this parade was finished, the captains disappeared, and each student went his own way. You will appreciate that it took a keen desire to learn to get anywhere in a school so badly run. However, most of the students made progress because, being destined to become instructors in their respective regiments, their self-respect made them fear not being up to the task, so they worked reasonably hard, but not as hard as one would as a schoolboy. As for behavior, the staff took no interest in it. As long as the students caused no trouble in the establishment itself, they were allowed to do as they pleased. They came and went at all hours. They were subject to no roll call. They ate in hotels if it suited them, slept out, and even went to Paris without asking permission. The non-commissioned pupils had a little less liberty. 2 moderately strict sergeants were in charge of them, who insisted that they were back by 10 o'clock at night. Each of us wore the uniform of his regiment, so that a gathering of the whole school presented an interesting sight, as when, on the first day of every month, we paraded in full dress in order to draw up the payroll. Then you could see the uniforms of all the French cavalry regiments. As all these officers belonged to different units, and were thrown together only for the duration of the course, there could not exist between them the close fellowship which is one of the features of regimental life. We were too numerous, 90 in all, for there to be a bond between everyone. There were coteries but no union. I did not feel any need to socialize with my new comrades. I left every Saturday for Paris, where I spent the next day and most of Monday with my mother. There were at Versailles 2 old friends of my mother, from Rennes, the Comtesse de Châteauville, a pair of very respectable and well-educated elderly ladies who entertained only a select society. I went 2 or 3 times a week to spend an evening with them. The remaining evenings I employed in reading, which I have always greatly enjoyed, for if school sets a man on the road to education, he must get there by himself through reading. How pleasant it was, in the midst of a very harsh winter, to come back to my quarters after dinner, make up a good fire, and there, alone, ensconced behind my screen and beside my little lamp, to read until 8 or 9 o'clock. Then I would go to bed, in order to save wood, and continue reading until midnight. In this way, I reread Tacitus and Xenophon, and many of the classical Greek and Roman authors. I revised the history of Rome and of France and the principal countries of Europe. My time, shared between my mother, my work at the school, a little good society, and my beloved books, passed very agreeably. I began the year 1803 at Versailles. Spring introduced some changes into my way of life. Each of the officers at the school was provided with a horse, so I devoted some of my evenings to taking long rides in the magnificent woods which surround Versailles, Marly, and Moudon. During May, my mother was made very happy by the release of her eldest brother from the Temple prison, and the return to France of the other 2, de Lille and de Lacoste, who, having been struck off the list of émigrés, came to Paris. The eldest of my mother's brothers, Monsieur de Canrobert, was a very pleasant, sensible man. He entered the service at a very young age as a sous-lieutenant in the infantry of Penthièvre, and, under Lieutenant General de Vaux, fought in all the campaigns of the war in Corsica, in which he distinguished himself. After the conquest of that country, he served out the 24 years which earned him the Cross of St. Louis. He was a captain when he married Mademoiselle Sanguinet, and then retired to the Château of Laval de Serres. Having become the father of a son and a daughter, Monsieur de Canrobert was living happily in his manor when the Revolution broke out in 1789. He was forced to emigrate to escape the scaffold with which he was threatened. All his possessions were confiscated and sold. His wife was imprisoned with her 2 young children. My mother obtained permission to visit her unhappy sister-in-law, and found her in a cold, damp tower, stricken by a fever which carried off, that very day, her young daughter. By dint of requests and supplications, my mother managed to obtain the release of her sister-in-law, but she died a few days later from the illness she had contracted in prison. My mother then took charge of the young boy, named Antoine. He was sent in turn to college and then to the military school, where he was one of their brightest pupils. Finally, he became an infantry officer and was killed, bravely, on the field of battle at Waterloo. My uncle was one of the first of the émigrés who, under the consulate, were given permission to return to France. He recovered some part of his estate and married again, this time to one of the daughters of Monsieur Niocel, an old friend of the family. Monsieur Certain de Lille, the second of my mother's brothers, was one of the most handsome men in France. At the time of the Revolution, he was a lieutenant in the regiment of Penthièvre, in which were also serving his elder brother and several of his uncles. He took the same course as nearly all his comrades and emigrated in company with his younger brother, Certain de Lacoste, who was in the king's bodyguard. After leaving France, the 2 brothers stayed always together. They retreated first to the country of Baden, but their tranquillity was soon disturbed. The French armies crossed the Rhine, and as all émigrés who fell into their clutches were shot, by order of the Convention, the brothers were forced to hide hurriedly in the interior of Germany. Lack of money compelled them to travel on foot, which soon became too much for poor Lacoste. They had great difficulty in finding lodgings, as everywhere was occupied by Austrian troops. Lacoste became ill. his brother supported him. In this way, they reached a little town in Württemberg, where they found a bed in a low-class tavern. At daybreak, they saw the Austrians leaving, and they were told that the French were about to occupy the town. Lacoste, unable to move, urged de Lisle to look to his own safety and to leave him to the care of Providence, but de Lisle declared solemnly that he would not abandon his sick brother. However, 2 French volunteers arrived at the inn with a requisition for lodgings. The innkeeper took them to the room occupied by my 2 uncles, whom he told that they would have to leave. It has been said, quite rightly, that during the Revolution, the honor of France took refuge in the army. The 2 soldiers, seeing that Lacoste was ill, told the landlord that not only did they wish to keep him with them, but that they wanted a large room which was on the first floor, where they would establish themselves with my 2 uncles. In enemy country, the victor being the master, the innkeeper obeyed the 2 French volunteers, who, during the 2 weeks in which their battalion was billeted in the town, took great care of Messrs. Lacoste and de Lisle, and even let them share in the good meals which their host was obliged to provide in accordance with the usages of war. This comfortable regime, coupled with rest, restored to some extent the health of Lacoste. When they left, the volunteers, who belonged to a battalion from the Gironde, wishing to give their new friends the means of passing through the French columns without being arrested, took from their uniforms the metal buttons which bore the name of their battalion, and attached them to the civilian clothing worn by my uncles, who could then pass themselves off as sutlers. With this new form of passport, they went through all the French cantonments without rousing any suspicion. They reached Prussia and settled down in the town of Hall, where de Lisle was able to give French lessons. They lived there peacefully until 1803, when my mother managed to have them struck off the list of émigrés, and they returned to France after 12 years of exile. Let us now return to Versailles. While I was on the course at the School of Cavalry, great events were underway in Europe. England, having broken the Treaty of Amiens, hostilities recommenced. The first consul resolved to take the initiative by leading an army onto the soil of Great Britain, a daring and difficult undertaking, but not impossible. To put it into operation, Napoleon, who had just seized Hanover, the private property of the English monarchy, stationed, on the coasts of the North Sea and the Channel, several army corps, and ordered the construction and assembly, at Boulogne and neighbouring ports, of an immense number of barges and flat-bottomed boats, on which he proposed to embark his troops. All the armed forces were set in motion for this war. I regretted that I was not involved, and, being destined to carry back to my regiment the knowledge I had acquired at the school, I saw myself condemned to spend several years in the depot, with a whip in my hand, making recruits trot round on elderly horses, while my comrades were fighting at the head of troops which I had trained. I did not find this prospect very pleasant, but how was it to be changed? A regiment must always be fed with recruits, and it was certain that my colonel, having sent me to the School of Cavalry to learn how to train these recruits, would not deprive himself of the services which I could render in this respect, and would keep me out of the fighting squadrons. One day, however, as I was walking down the Avenue de Paris, with my drill manual in my hand, I had a brilliant idea, which totally changed my destiny, and contributed greatly to my promotion to the rank which I now occupied. I had just learned that the first consul, having fallen out with the court of Lisbon, had ordered the formation, at Bayonne, of an army corps destined to enter Portugal under the command of General Augereau. I knew that General Augereau owed some of his advancement to my father, under whose command he had served in the camp at Toulouse and in the Pyrenees, and although what I had experienced at Genoa, after the death of my father, had not given me a high opinion of the gratitude of mankind, I resolved to write to him, and, having explained the predicament in which I found myself, ask him to extricate me by taking me on as one of his aides-de-camp. Having written this letter, I sent it to my mother, to see if she approved. She not only approved, but, knowing that Augereau was in Paris, she decided to take the letter to him herself. Augereau received the widow of his old friend with the greatest consideration. He immediately took his carriage and went to the War Ministry, and that same evening he handed to my mother my appointment as aide-de-camp. Thus, a wish, which 24 hours earlier had seemed a dream, became a reality. The following day I hurried to Paris to thank the general. He received me most kindly, and ordered me to join him at Bayonne, to where he was now going. It was now October. I had completed the first course at the School of Cavalry, and had little interest in starting on the second. So I was happy to leave Versailles, for I felt sure that I was starting on a new career, much more advantageous than that of a regimental instructor. I was quite right in thinking this, for 9 years later I was a colonel, while those I had left at the school had hardly reached the rank of captain. I reported promptly to Bayonne and took up my post as an aide-de-camp to the commander-in-chief. He was installed a quarter of a league from the town, in the fine Château de Marac, in which the emperor lived some years later. I was made very welcome by General Augereau and by my new comrades, his aides-de-camp, nearly all of whom had served under my father. This general staff, although it did not give to the army as many general officers as that of Bernadotte, was nevertheless very well made up. General Danzelot, who was the chief of staff, was a highly capable man who later became the governor of the Ionian Islands and then Martinique. His second in command was Colonel Albert, who, at his death, was general aide-de-camp to the Duc d'Orléans. The aides-de-camp were Colonel Sicard, who died at Heilsberg, Major Bram, who retired to Lille after the Peace of Tilsit, Major Massy, killed as a colonel at Moscow, Captain Chevetel, and Lieutenant Mainville, the first of whom retired to his estate in Brittany, and the second ended his career in Bayonne. I was the sixth and youngest of the aides-de-camp. Finally, the staff was completed by Dr. Raymond, who helped me greatly at Eylau, and Colonel Augereau, a half-brother of the general, a very quiet man, who later became a lieutenant general. That concludes the 13th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.